Good afternoon, and welcome to HealthSystemCIO.com's All-Star Panel, Architecting Towards a Single Source of Data Truth, a webinar tweet chat combo from HealthSystemCIO.com. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. My name is Anthony Guerra. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of HealthSystemCIO.com, and I will be your moderator today. We are having a simultaneous tweet chat hosted by our Managing Editor and Director of Social Media, Kate Gamble. You can participate in a separate browser or on your phone by using the hashtag HSCIOchat, or you can simply view the the tweet chat in the Media Viewer panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Other WebEx panels we'll be using today will be the Q&A panel, which you can use to submit questions as they occur to you. Type it into the Q&A panel, send it in, leave the default set to all panelists. We will take those questions later in the program, but send them in as they occur to you. And we're going to use the polling panel today, which will automatically open when we launch a poll, and that should spark some conversation for us. And you could use the URL in front of you to download the deck for today's event. Our panel today is made up of Joel Venko, SVP and CIO at Baystate Health, and Tressa Springman, SVP and CIO at LifeBridge Health. We're going to go about 45 minutes in total, 35 with our panel, and then some audience Q&A. So without any further delay, we'll get started. Joel, let's start with you. Can you give me an overview of Baystate?
Sure. Thanks, Anthony. Pleasure to be here. So Baystate Health is a large health system in western Massachusetts. It's a 5-hospital health system. We've got about 90 medical groups. We have a commercial health plan that we own, about 250,000 members. And we are also in the lab business. We've got a large reference lab that we oversee, and it basically goes across the state of Massachusetts. We also are a part of Next Generation ACO, Medicare ACO, that we've been undertaking for now about 2.5 years. And recently, we've just joined the Medicaid ACO frontline here in Massachusetts, and we're basically taking 40,000 of our Medicaid patients and putting them at risk. Baystate's a $2.5 billion organization, and we're happy to tell our story.
Very good. Thank you, Joel. Tressa, a little bit about LifeBridge.
Great. Thanks, and good afternoon, everyone. LifeBridge Health is a $2 billion in revenue health system in Maryland, and we've got about 10,000 associates, 4 hospitals, over, 400 or 500 employed physicians. But I think our real unique twist, aside from being in Maryland, which is one of the few waivered states from a Medicare perspective, we really have focused quite a bit recently on investments and joint partnerships in healthcare, but non-hospital healthcare. So lots of joint ventures in home health, post-acute, ambulance companies, retail pharmacy, hospice, you name it. So that's a little bit about us, and perhaps some of those similarities and uniquenesses will provide some context to the data architecture conversation today. Thanks.
Excellent. Very good. Tressa, let's start with you now. How long have you been with your health system, and what did you find from a data architecture point of view when you arrived?
Sure, thanks. So I've been here 4.5 years. At LifeBridge, and even over this time, we have grown double in terms of revenues, and then a very different approach to this for-profit sector, part of the healthcare system. And so when we talk about data architecture, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about it later, the word that I really use is one that evolves, because through the acquisition activity and the partnerships and just the heterogeneity of the work that we're doing, there isn't a one-size-fits-all. So I didn't walk into a core EDW, Enterprise Data Warehouse concept, a physical concept here. we had more of a federated model, and the reality is that our dynamic growth of the organization has really contributed to that continuing. So a lot of our focus has been much more around decision-making structure and governance, understanding what a quickly changing landscape we have.
Tressa, what sort of investigation do most CIOs do of this aspect of the health system before they take on a job? Is this something you inquire about, you want a sort of a blueprint for, you want to know what you're getting into type thing, or is this something you find out after you start?
Depends on how many questions you ask. You know, I think that specific to my role here, as many of us know, one of the real foundational questions that you ask when joining an organization is, do you have a strategic plan? Do you have an information technology strategic plan? And, you know, upon review, really trying to ascertain, is this organization culturally aligned with what I want to do? You know, are they a consensus adopter or an aggressive adopter of technology? And I think most of us do have some very similar trends on what to look for. You know, this last couple of years have been around using data for better decision making, and more specifically to influence point of care decisions, i.e. pop health, cybersecurity. So there are more seasonal or situational influences that are part of the dialogue when you're onboarding in an organization, and I think that most CIOs who are going through a transition, a discussion about what the data governance and data architecture is around this whole maturity spectrum of reporting to predictive analytics is certainly one of those trending topics that most CIOs would inquire after.
Joel, in addition to answering the question as it's stated, I would imagine, you know, as we were saying with Tressa, when you're coming into an organization, you want to make sure that you're going to be able to be successful there. You want to make sure that based on what they want you to achieve or what the health system wants to be able to do, that the pieces either are in place or you'll be able to put them in place through sufficient funding, because you don't want to disconnect there. This is what we expect you to do, but you're not going to get the tools to do it. So wherever you want to tackle that whole thing.
Yeah, no, so that's, I think that there's certainly, to Tressa's point, I think a very different sort of era for CIOs. You know, when I started at Baystate back in 2012, so pretty much the same time that Tressa started LifeBridge, you know, there was some discussion about analytics from the folks that were interviewing me, but that really wasn't necessarily their sort of direct focus, because at that time a lot of the focus was implementation of a technology or a platform that actually ingested or consumed information. And while, you know, I think many of us who were getting interviews at that point in time were asking about, well, are you guys prepared to really sort of take the next journey beyond implementation, ergo analytics and insight, there was still this larger notion of implementation of the EHR, because we were just in that phase. But today, you know, there's a lot more, I think, discussion, especially when you're onboarding, about, you know, do you have a sense as the incoming CIO what you're going to need to get us towards that data-driven, information-driven decision-making that Tressa had mentioned. And you know, at some level, that's also a very complex discussion, because, you know, unlike I think the more tangible price points of an EHR implementation, there's a lot of unknowns in creating and developing and designing not just the data architecture for interoperability analytics, but also just the entire platform end to end. There's still a lot of discovery, you know, being made today as to how to really sort of architect that, all the way down to the terminology informatics perspective, which can be a very expensive plumbing exercise, if you will. And so quantifying that and understanding, you know, what would that really mean for the organization can be very, very challenging. And so, I think that's one of the things that has been a sort of a headwind for me in my journey here at Baystate, and I'm sure for others, is I think the notion of how much this sort of all kind of costs is still sort of intangible and largely unknown. I mean, I think we can make some general estimates, and we have, and to pitch this to your board or to your leadership so that you could actually get funding, you got to create some level of a pro forma. But there are things that I think as we turn stones over, that we're going to find that the data's got to be curated in such a manner, and it's going to take this much time and this much expense, and those are things that I think we're going to continuously discover as we start to unpack these systems that we've been implementing over the past 5 to 7 years.
Joel, is it possible that when we look at the costs of implementing these systems, the core EHR, EDW, turning over all the rocks to get us the vision of where we want to be, that the numbers just simply don't add up? That the monies available, the profits to your average health system do not allow for the kind of expense that will get you the data everyone wants?
Well, I think that's, it's really, I mean, I guess the answer is that you really need to understand what you're going after, and what kind of phased approach that you're going to take. So, I mean, there are certainly things that, again, to Tressa's point about the continuum of analytics or reporting to analytics that you can do immediately that will make an impact to the way that you operate your organization. I would say that it's probably a safe bet that many health systems are still struggling to get, a report that is not sort of built in Access or in Excel and it's sort of cobbled together by some, or a number of analysts in the background to really understand what their census is or what telemetry days, sort of telemetry utilization they have, or other sort of operational metrics that could help drive their business to more optimal levels. So, I think that there are immediate use cases that can certainly show some level of return, and then there are these sort of, blue sky sort of activities that we've been talking about for the last, decade, like predictive analytics and prescriptive analytics and AI and, machine learning, which is now in vogue. I mean, those are things that are certainly sexy and can be expensive, and I think if you don't understand what you're looking to get out of them, it can be sort of for naught, right? It'll be an expensive proposition that you don't receive any kind of payback for immediately. So there are ways to incrementally phase this out, which I'm sure we'll talk about sometime during this call, but those are I think, the steps that one must take to show not just the value in the investment, but also the value in the data, because that's another sort of philosophical discussion at times. I think, health systems aren't necessarily sure, while we, I think, often say we aren't necessarily sure that decisions need to be data-driven all the time. And I would argue that, everything should be data-driven, or most things should be data-driven. Like, for example, putting an urgent care in the middle of a community, I think historically we just sort of put our finger to the wind and say, I think it's going west here, so let's go this way, right? So, you know what I mean? So, but that's not how Target does it, right? That's not how Starbucks does it, or any other retail organization does it. We have to be that way, and we have to be more efficient, because we're not going to have reimbursements increase in the future, and so we got to do better at the way that we actually conduct business.
Very good. All right, Tressa, let's go back to you. Talk about what you have in place today. You talked about when you started there, 4.5 years, and the evolutionary approach, which is a question we have later, but we can touch on it now. So, talk about the evolution, where you are today in the journey of getting there.
Great. Sure. Thanks. So, I would say that LifeBridge had really, the person in my shoes had done a great job taking to the organization this idea of putting more structure and context around how we manage our data with intentionality, you know, a governance and data stewardship. Sadly, I think it was a little ahead of its time, and this is one of those areas which we're all learning as we implement new tools, really take partnerships across the aisle with our operational partners. And, you know, back then it was, these are reports and we just need the reports. We don't really know what you're talking about until you start calling forward examples that suggest that there are probably 5 different ways to define an FTE, and depending on who you are at the table in our organization, you probably define it differently, and your source data is different, et cetera. So, you know, we had islands of understanding, we had redundancy, we had, you know, data lakes is a big word. We had lots of those all over the place. And, you know, we had some of the, what folks would know as historical front runners to today's EDW. We even had elements of EDW. What we really didn't have was a thoughtful and rigorous approach to how we were going to get everyone on the same page around data governance and discussing the hard work of what the data definitions were, so that when the information was coming out of this schema and the architecture that we had in place, that people wouldn't argue about the data. They would have trust in it because they'd understand what the data meant, what it was defined as. And those are really detailed, time-consuming, unsexy conversations that organizations have to have, and yet it takes a real appetite and understanding that it's worth that investment to get to information on the other end of those conversations. So, you know, we've really been spending a lot of time on organizational structure and governance and discussion in parallel with developing what I would call more of a federated roadmap. You know, I mentioned a little bit about some of our acquisition and merger activity. You know, in my past life, I had the benefit and blessing of being given, you know, a handful of money and time, i.e. my adage of $5 million in 5 years to go figure it out from an enterprise perspective, because it was a greenfield. You know, here I walked in and I had one of everything. And so really trying to use that data domain and governance structure to help inform the technology roadmap that we had to put into place. And, you know, I'll be honest, and part of this is culture at LifeBridge, we aren't ever going to be a single system shop. And I think that holds true for our data architecture strategy and approach too. You know, if we had the ability to take the time to get our data, especially from our non-acute settings, from home health and our ambulance companies, all transformed, harmonized, and normalized and loaded into a single enterprise for decision-making, I guarantee you that it wouldn't be timely decision-making. So it's one of those adages where you're putting air in the tires as you're riding the bike as quickly as you can. So, you know, I feel thrilled and very grateful for the progress that the folks on my leadership team and my other operational stakeholders have made in joining us in this journey. But again, a lot of the discussion has been around governance, and those decisions have then informed how we have built out our data model.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think that's your emphasis, Tressa, on governance is key here. And you know, I've made in my past lives sort of the mistake of going too fast towards a solution and saying, hey, we got to focus on developing a report or an analytic for this area. But this idea of alignment and governance are really sort of key starting points. And I would also add that, you know, governance is sort of multifaceted, right? There's this notion of having, you know, multidisciplinary leaders at the table sort of governing the direction of where you sort of want to go with what we call on our end the Center for Analytics, right? But then there's also this point of sort of data governance itself, which is one, I'll call it one layer sort of below that, and really sort of focused on the operational processes of handling the data itself, creating the data definitions and or the metric definitions, alignment around sort of what does it, to your point, what does an FTE really mean? What does a length of stay really mean? How is that constructed? Those are things that are absolutely necessary before one even gets into the sort of the physical technology choices that one may make, because until you can get the enterprise, and to your point, a very, sort of multivariate and sort of multi-sourced, but also, kind of multi-requirement driven enterprise, you need to understand where the ship has to be steered, and that governance body is going to be crucial in doing so.
Yeah, I think, Anthony, back to the question you posed about a CIO considering a new position and the success factor here. Look, various organizations have different cultural readiness about this discussion. And, truly, I have learned that this is one of those areas where we really need to do the hard work, even if you're, hitting your head against the wall multiple times in getting your other partners to the table. Because this isn't something that the information services or technology function can just buy and plug in.
Mm-hmm.
It just doesn't work that way. So I think back to your question about in an onboarding situation, if there are goals, very auspicious or enthusiastic or perhaps far-reaching goals in this area as part of your onboarding, it's really critically important to understand culturally, do folks get it, or is part of your role going to be the evangelist to help your peers that run other parts of the company understand why they need to have their own seat at the table?
Right, and it sounds like it truly is, so two parts of the equation. You have to have the technologies in place, but you also have to have the data governance in place to get the terms right, make sure we're all using the same terms, make sure the data is understood to be, we're all speaking the same language, right? And if you have just the technology without the other, you're going to have garbage data. And if you just have governance without the tools, that's not going to work either. Does that make sense, Tressa?
Yeah, it does to me. I mean, specific to your point, and just to be specific, when we say governance, for us, it includes elements of assigning domain leadership. So what do I mean by that? We talk about a lot of redundancy, and we have a lot of inefficiencies in the information that we offer up to others. But if the organization, anyone in our organization, is seeking answers to questions around, let's say, employee turnover, for example, that data domain is under the umbrella and the function, the structural accountability of our Chief of Human Resources. And, his team has a seat at the table around governance, and not only do they help us with data definitions, but we're trying to mature to a place where they really are the filter through which these types of requests come, as opposed to just through the back door of IT or through a self-service analytics application, because it's critical as their domain of knowledge that the information as an asset to support human resources is something under their control, not mine.
Interesting, very interesting.
Yeah,
go ahead.
And that is a challenge I think that folks need to understand as you operationalize, whatever you want to call it, an EDW or an analytics platform, is that, number one, as the CIO, you're never going to get probably any more resources than you've got today, especially if you're trying to create this large analytics shop. It's, you're going to ask for 30 bodies. That's a non-starter. But there are pockets of analytics, or rather analysts out in the domains, like the HR folks or the pharmacy informaticists that may be out there, that really should own their domain. And the challenge is to align them on using the platform that you're trying to or attempting to build and develop, as well as be a part of that process, that overall process that governance is putting into place for that analytics platform. And I think that's really the the charge that as you go into this, you have to understand how do you align these folks, how do you sort of get a shared vision and understanding of how to move forward, and that can be quite a challenge up front, particularly if folks are already doing things in their silo. They have reports that they have believed in for the last decade, and they feel that they can do it better and more efficiently than if they end up using your tools. So you have to really have some level of diplomacy and engagement and collaboration with them so that you can move this needle forward.
Very good, very good. All right, Tressa, let's look at this question. What types of resources, financial and personnel, do you need to create a modern data architecture?
Are you going to find some for me?
Yeah, I think Joel's going to send some over.
Yeah, so,
Done.
I do want to, okay, I'll take those too, knowing you're in budget season up there. The answer to this, very similarly, I was just listening intently to Joel's response to the prior question, and, I suspect we have some folks on the phone, and I know I've been in both bigger organizations and smaller organizations, and very culturally different organizations than I am in today. So good news, bad news. I think the good news is on this whole EDW analytics, throw it all into the mix of the conversation. There's much more information, including maturity curves and folks in the industry who've been very helpful getting organizations going. So we're not necessarily all at the crawl stage. But having said that, there totally is not a one-size-fits-all, right? So when we talk about either what kind of resources from a financial and personnel perspective or what kind of funding, the real answer, Anthony, sadly, is it depends. It depends on where you're starting, where you're heading, what your organizational priority is, what your organizational ability to fund is, and then some of the cultural nuances. I've been in organizations where IT was funded for and was intended to be a very centralized enterprise place to service up information for the company. In my current organization, it's very different. It's much more of a federated model where those lines of responsibility and discussion are managed through governance, not through reporting relationships. So to the comments that Joel made, we've got some really good subject matter experts, analysts out in these data domain areas that we, put our arms around and pull to the ongoing conversation about acquiring data really in a much more collaborative way and with a federated model that exists. So, the types of resources that one needs to create the data architecture, like many, many other answers, rolls right back up to what's your strategic plan, what are your tactics for this year, what needs to be supported by analytics, and then a gap between what we have today and what we need. So, absent that, if given a big blank piece of paper, I'm back to the give me $5 or $6 million in 5 years to do it. But there's no appetite or patience for that. And so the reality is, what do we need to go after this year? And in our, as we all know, constrained economics, what trade-offs are we going to make to allow analytics to very robustly support these specific initiatives that our organization is tackling today in this culture and where we are on our own maturity curve? So I'm sure that sounded like a total non-answer, but at this point, I'll let Joel step in.
Joel?
I thought that was a perfect answer, and I couldn't agree more. I think it does depend. But if I was to take one slice of that and just say, let's say we're going to focus on a clinical, analytics, module for, let's say our pharmacy staff, or for maybe some of our clinicians, just to go down that one vertical, what I've found is that, the first thing that we absolutely need to understand is that, the sources that we're pulling from, how good is that data, and, how clean is that data, rather. And that sort of will determine a lot for you in terms of what you're going to need, whether you're going to need somebody that can already get down to the development of a canonical dimensional model, or do you have to do some heavy curation and plumbing to not only extract the data, but to normalize it and standardize it, and really have a process that continues to cleanse it in a more automated service-like fashion. And so, to me, as I look at that, it always is clear that I need to have some level of a terminologist or an informaticist who can really understand, what the terminology or the data structure needs to be, post the source system. And I think, I'm getting a little too deep on that, but that to me is one of the things that we've discovered. And it's not necessarily hard to extract data and put it into an EDW, but to do it in a sustainable form requires somebody that really knows, that sort of level of informatics. And there are few and far between. And so sort of, Tessa joked, if you can send them to me, I'd take them. And that's really, I think, the problem that we do have. X out the data scientists, which is kind of, again, a buzzword, but, there are folks that are still required to do plumbing and to do normalization of this data to try to put it into that eventual architecture. We're missing those experts, really. And many of those experts actually do work in the data domains, but they also need to be trained in sort of formalizing those structures for end use. And so I think we're still in this evolution stage, this maturity stage, where the expertise is really just growing, and the complexity of the data is certainly getting more and more complex. And so at some point we're going to have those two things meet so that we can really address the kinds of analytics that we need for the future.
Yeah, Joel, you mentioned the idea that some of these folks with this expertise are few and far between, and whenever we have anything that's few and far between, it's expensive. So not only are the tools expensive and everything under the rocks you mentioned, but getting these folks, they're not coming cheap, right? I mean, they know their value in the market.
Yeah, it's and I've been very fortunate, actually, because one of the folks that I go to, a group that I go to, and I won't, mention the name because I don't think this is the time and place to advertise, but certainly, and I certainly want to have them work for me. And not be distracted necessarily, but I've been fortunate to have these folks sort of be with me in many different stages of my career, and so that's kind of a nice to have. But again, they can only do so much, and yet there are so many things that they should be and could be doing, for a bunch of other organizations. And so one of the things that we'd been looking for when we first started down this journey was, a consortium-like, kind of organization where we're not in this journey alone. And I think, one of the things that we all need to figure out as health systems is, are there ways where we can begin to share the findings, share the data architectures, share the modules that sit on top of that architecture, so that we can get to the end game much faster. And that was kind of an experiment for us in getting into what I'll call this sort of consortium analytics in the cloud sort of situation with an organization that will go nameless. But I also brought these informaticists that I was talking about into that organization and said, hey, let's use these guys to start working on developing services that transform data. So it won't only benefit me, but it'll benefit all those that are on similar data architecture in this consortium. And so, I think we need to start being creative, since those resources are few and far between, and try to figure out how we can sort of help each other in that regard. And I think that there's a lot of potential for that, but also we also have to look at creating an informatics program for in academia, just to get us to the level of capacity that we need to move this.
Very good. All right, we've got a few questions that have come in already, so I want to get to those. Tressa, I don't know if you want to take a stab at this, but let's throw it out there. Has there been much consideration to using a blockchain architecture to ensure data redundancy?
Nope, that's a good one for Joel.
Kick it right over to Joel.
No,
that hot potato's on your lap, Joel.
No. I'll make a comment and say that, well, blockchain is a very, very interesting concept, and we've got a couple of team members who are investigating it because of, you know, to the point of the questioner, the ability to, if you will, validate the integrity of the information being surfaced. We have not acted on that in our data architecture at this point.
Joel?
Yeah, we're in the same position. In fact, the first use case for us really is looking at how our health information exchange can leverage, you know, blockchain. So we haven't looked at it from a data integrity perspective for analytics just yet, but you know, we're sort of starting with this notion of, you know, managing redundancy or managing validation of data through the use of it in our health information exchange. So that's where we are with that.
Great. Okay, Tressa, let's go with you on this. When you talk about governance, does that include policies?
So, yeah, it does. And I would say, however, a lot of the discussion that our governance group has had, and then the groups that support it, we now have a kind of supporting structure that includes all of the subject matter experts in the data domains, et cetera. I would say a lot of their work has been on discussing standard work. You know, discussing perhaps not as much policy as agreement on standard process, so that the frustration of people showing up in the same meeting with data that doesn't reconcile. Therefore, the discussion is debate of data and mistrust as opposed to problem solving. You know, so as I think about it, and I'm trying to think, I mean, certainly there are a lot of policies we have in place about making data available from a public perspective and the integrity therein, but a lot of the governance discussion that has resulted in what I would call a more administrative type of tool have been really much more about agreed upon ways of doing things, more procedures, not something that ends up being committed to a policy function, if that helps. So what do I mean by that? You know, this group has come together and they've said, okay, let's define how requests for information will get vetted, and let's put together our own interdisciplinary team to do it and make sure that we can do it virtually, so we're very quick about it, but not have things just flow traditionally into an IS help desk queue. So those are the kinds of administrative tools that they have not only discussed, but they've built to come up with better and more standard ways of organizationally governing how we service up information.
Joel, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, that's basically our conversation also. I would just add that, you know, for us, we are using this governance body to consider or discuss that type of externalization of the data. So let me give you an example. You know, we're obviously using some level of data feeds to source the requirements in our Technology Innovation Center, TechSpring. And so one of the things that we do at TechSpring is that we provide data to our innovators, our startups, vendors who are a part of that innovation center. And so that sort of level of access goes through that governance body, and we have, you know, some level of policy development in there that states these are the kinds of things that can and can't be done with that information or that data. Additionally, we're also discussing externalization of this data to patients vis-a-vis analytic modules, and so the sort of the discussion around, what's appropriate, how much data and information and analytics can we provide to patients before, they begin to get confused, or if it's too much in terms of, benchmarking or aggregation of that data for them to use and do self-serving or self-serve analytics. Those are kinds of discussions that we're having right now, and I suspect that the governance body will begin to propose, things that will become policy in the future for that data acquisition or that data access by those external parties.
Very good. Tressa, you touched on a bit of this, but another audience question is, how do you start the conversation about building standards prior to creating a warehouse?
I haven't had that benefit. It's all been kind of messy in the middle of it. And it's taken lots of runs at the wall because it's when you look at the maturity curve for this topic, you start with transactional reports. And in that transactional report world, people ask for a report and someone gives it to them. And so that's their mindset. And really, an organization that hasn't moved forward on that maturity curve to understand that as you move to more self-service, that it's a whole different type of relationship that includes, personal engagement in being aware of the data and sometimes even being a part of getting the data, that absolutely informs the whole conversation around governance. So you kind of have to start where you start, and like anything else, it's really assessing what are the tools we have in place, what are the operational constraints that we're running into or problems that we're having, or perhaps customer service measures around making data or information available that we could be doing a better job on, and partnering that with, for me at least, many different conversations to get enough of a critical mass and then an inflection point with other organizational leaders who get it. And, then it just kind of starts coming together and it starts getting momentum. And, starting with either people who are historically very comfortable with data, in our organization it's finance, or some of our new areas, and I don't mean new, they're very comfortable with data, but much more visible now in a at-risk type of world around population health and our quality teams. So for me, it hasn't been necessarily governance being the track in front of the train. We've had both, and we've really had to, as we've had and matured the governance and the stewardship and the data domain discussions, have really been able to example our current state architecture as either being enabling or being a constraint to what we're trying to do. So I think it'd be great, but I also think it might be kind of hard to bring people to the table and say, if we don't do this, we're going to have a problem. So just believe me in that regard, because human nature is, I'm going to move on to my next priority. I'm not going to tackle this problem. But most of us probably, as I could kind of pick up my flashlight and shine a light on a lot of examples where my stakeholders in the governance process say, yeah, that really is a problem, or that's really inefficient, or we really can be doing a much better job of this. So again, I haven't had the benefit of putting a governance in place ahead of a complete architecture, and I think most folks don't or can't. And I'm interested from Joel or anyone else who believes that this is a discussion that's easy to have if you can't demonstrate why it's so important.
I agree, Tressa. I think that's really, for us, it's just about shining the light on how we could get to the end game more efficiently or more optimized. So, maybe I'm saying the same thing as you, but for us, this has opened the door to having conversations about document standardization or documentation standardization. It's opened the door for, talking about how do we enter data into the EHR or other source systems, and should we standardize that at entry, or is that too cumbersome for workflow, and therefore, we can bite the bullet on it on the backside and make the transformation happen or impute what the data really means. But those are things that I think as we continue down this process, we can ask ourselves within the governance and the operational teams to say, if we want to make sure that this is at the level, these analytics or these data are at the level we want it to be in at the EDW level, here's what we need to do at the front end. And our architecture right now is such that we're actually drawing from both the data lake and sort of the more structured EDW platform to create some of the analytics that we need or the reports that we need for folks in the enterprise. And so we always have the opportunity to show them how we're constructing these reports or analytics, and then also show them, what we did to actually get to that particular metric. And sometimes it can be eye-opening because folks will say, well, did you impute that, or was that a direct, outcome from the data? And I think that's the conversation that definitely can be had in terms of how do we continue to standardize and make better the data in the entry point so that it can be a more optimized output.
Very good. All right, I want to sneak in one more question before we wrap it today from the audience. Joel, let's start with you on this one. A federated model with domain ownership makes sense, but when the request requires data from multiple sources of truth and you have no EDW, what's the operational workaround? We can only bring people together in so many working groups and committees.
Wow, that is a mouthful and a tough problem, I suppose. I'll sort of just state this. I guess if there is no EDW and you have these sort of continuous requests, gosh, I do think that's a tough position to be in for sure. And I think that's where we were, and at some level we still are in IT, at least in my shop today, because there are domains that we haven't yet, either put into our data lake or into the EDW, and for now they are receiving either ad hoc reports or some analytics, and or they're sort of fending for themselves. And so, I think I don't really have a great answer for that, other than the hope is that domain can be brought along quickly, and the folks that are asking for that type of asset, they can see the value quickly in the EDW that's being built for them, or an EDW that can be useful for them in the future. So I don't know, Tressa, if you've got a better answer than that, but that's a tough one.
I was going to ask Anthony to restate the question.
Oh, no problem. No problem. I'll read it again. A federated model with domain ownership makes sense, but when the request requires data from multiple sources of truth and you have no EDW, what's the operational workaround? We can only bring people together in so many working groups and committees.
Yeah, and boy, is that a constraint, right? So one method, a technical method, is to use a common visualization tool. So even if your multiple sources of truth, your wizards behind the curtain, so to speak, are some different data sources, that doesn't mean that you don't have good metadata on the data being surfaced, and a common visualization tool will give the end user the ability for a single experience, right? So that's a technical way to bridge some of this, I ain't got it all in the same place right now. I do think that there are some very practical challenges in making this, an activity of committee, that's for sure. And so, you know, as we talk about this being more of a journey, right, a process than an endpoint, that's where, at least in our structure, we are identifying areas that increase in request and frequency and demand because of what's going on in the industry or in our community, and those are the areas of data that ultimately have some priority of getting appropriately ETL'd into an easier to digest type of construct, so that there aren't having to be the same frequency of exception conversations. So I hope that helps. But my suggestion in that case is, you know, where there's a frequency of need for this type of information, that's ripe for a revisit on improving the way you can get at that data.
Excellent, excellent. Well, that's about all we had time for today. When you close out your WebEx window, you'll be taken to a post-event survey. If you could take a moment to answer that, we'd appreciate it. Regarding continuing education, those of you who hold the CHIME CHCIO certification get 1 CEU for attending any of our events. Let CHIME know you were here, and if you've asked us to do so, we will. Certificate of attendance, if you need one for another CEU program, you can use the final slide in this deck. You'll receive an email when our archive recording of this event has been posted to our YouTube channel. If you'd like us to produce a webinar on the topic of your choice, please contact Nancy Wilcox. And you can go to our website to view our upcoming schedule of events. So once again, I want to very much thank our participants and panelists, Joel Venko and Tressa Springman, and I want to thank you, our attendees, for joining our events. And with that, everybody have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joel and Anthony.